when I started NoEstimates, the core idea was to replace the practice of estimation. That was the core idea. NoEstimates these days is as much a risk management strategy, which Agile in itself is, now a lot more than it is a replacement for the estimation practice. And that, of course, comes through evolution, through application of the ideas, through learning and through adaptation. NoEstimates has a lot of applications on product management today that weren't clear in the book, because I wasn't writing the book for that kind of reader. But if I would write the book today, I would definitely include the product management impact of the NoEstimates approach today, because estimation, it's a little bit like taking the layers off the onion. Like the first layer was the estimation practice. And then when you took that layer off, you started to realize where that estimation practice was coming from. What were the reasons why we were using estimates? And when you understand that, you start to replace those other practices with other approaches. For example, anyone listening to us today knows that the scope is variable in any software project. That in itself invalidates most of the use for what was called estimation when I wrote the book, right? These days, nobody really looks at estimation that way anymore. Everybody accepts in the software industry, everybody accepts that scope will vary. That's not even in cause anymore. But of course, that also means that, well, if scope will vary, then whatever is based on scope being fixed, like estimates, becomes an invalid theory, because the core aspect, the core fact that supports the theory for the use of estimates is gone.
Hey guys, welcome to the show. Next episode of Let's Talk Agile. I have a legend here, the author of the book on NoEstimates and a big believer of things to do differently, Vasco Duarte. Vasco, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Alex. And first of all, I want to say thank you for inviting me, obviously, but also thank you for the work that you're doing in bringing up some of these topics on LinkedIn, where we actually met first and discussed. Then after that, over a Zoom call, some of the topics we're going to explore today. So thank you for doing that work as well.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I do have a tendency to get myself in trouble. Somebody criticized me the other day that I'm very opinionated and I've been laying low for way too long, not sharing my thoughts. So they told me to be a little more aggressive, and I have, but which is great because I've been meeting a lot of people that way. Certainly, thanks for reacting to my comments. And I guess here we go. So I read the book a long time ago. I had it downloaded on my Kindle, but then I lost the Kindle and I've never gotten back to it. But recently I read it from cover to cover, and it's almost 10 years since NoEstimates book came out. And I know you were doing a lot of presentations in 2014, kind of talking about that with the community. But there's been a huge shift right now. People are kind of frustrated with Agile. People are frustrated with Scrum. People are frustrated with anything. I'm curious to get your perspective where things are now. Where do you think, NoEstimates lives as its, independent movement? And possibly with all the shifting of what's happening right now, where teams and developers are being more vocal about their dislike of the development process.
Well, so there's a lot of questions.
Yeah, well, let's go from the top.
Yeah, so let's start with the whole Agile is Dead, I think, vibe, one could call it, because it isn't really a movement. When people just complain about something, it can't really be a movement. I'm reminded of a phrase I heard many years ago, and the phrase goes something like this: you can't talk to fish about water.
I like that. That's pretty cool.
And I think we are like incredibly privileged for being alive in 2024 and criticizing Agile or Scrum or whatever, SAFe, or, pick your favorite target for criticism. Because a lot of the people who are working today, and Alex, you and I are old enough to know this, a lot of the people who are working today in a company that happens to use any Agile framework probably never worked in Waterfall ever. So it's like they're complaining about something without understanding why it emerged and what was there before it. And this is a very common thing. I mean, this happens with philosophy. It happens in science. It happens in all kinds of fields, right? Like where people are they are born in a context where the reason for that context being different than the past isn't clear anymore because they never experienced the past. They are born in that new context. And a lot of people complaining about Agile today will say things like, Scrum has too many meetings. Well, let me tell you something. Have you ever been in a Waterfall project?
Yeah, you're going to have a meeting to discuss every bug individually, and you're going to have painful meetings of everyone involved on the project or product.
Like 50 people in a status call where you would go through every single item on a very long item list for like an hour, 2 hours, sometimes even 4 or 5 hours. But that lack of memory is perfectly understandable. When people complain about the 5 ceremonies that are in Scrum and say they take too much time, we should code longer and be in meetings less, that they don't know because they never experienced it, or they forget that we used to have a lot worse situation. For example, in project management, one of the core ideas that many people don't remember is that there are no teams. Teams, it's actually a very high level abstraction in project management. Because there is
they do the matrix organization structure, which is good luck figuring out what that means.
And it basically means that there's one project manager assigning tasks to every single person in the team. And that may mean marketing, sales, design, coding, testing, support, whatever. Like impossible for one project manager or even a group of them, if you're in a program, to understand all of the small little details that need to be tackled. It's not possible. That's why Agile came about, because we wanted to build projects around a small group of talented and motivated individuals, right? That's it. It's right there in the Agile Manifesto. And the reason why that came up was that we understood that it is through the collaboration of these people in the project that things actually get done. It's not through the planning that planning is still important, don't get me wrong, but it's not through the planning that things get done. It's through having people meeting and working together. And project, Alex, as you know, because you do that yourself, software doesn't happen without groups of people anymore. Right? Like the myth of the single developer in the basement somewhere, that's gone. That's over. It's not anymore possible.
And it's interesting because a lot of times we hear the feedback from folks that are like solo people, like they can code the entire system from top to bottom. We've come a long way with components, libraries, and tooling, and AI now, where it seems like we're going to have a lot of one-man army people. And back in our day, we used to call them cowboys, and they were hard to control. They would do wild things just because they wanted to do it, not actually grasping the impact of the scope whenever they would get too much into the technical weeds. The reason I know is because I used to be one. So I would get that level too in the beginning before I turned into a much more mature engineer. But I think also it's interesting about all the criticism in Agile because you have the contrary. We have too many meetings and our meetings are not effective, but our meetings are time boxed to 15 minutes. So like a retrospective for 10 people taking 15 minutes is not a retrospective that allows anybody to clear their thoughts. And even like you don't want to time box that. Just let people talk. This is frustrations, emotions, experiences that needs to be channeled to the outside world of a very introverted industry. It takes time. And what we need to do is we need to bubble things up. And if we compress everything and call it all waste, this is going to create a different type of hatred where my voice never counts. Right?
Yeah. And I do think we do have a responsibility to kind of clarify what it is that is written in the, let's call it the reference texts for the Agile frameworks or processes that are out there. And nothing in the Scrum book, which is, if we're talking about time boxing, that's one of the Agile process frameworks that institutionalized the idea of a time box. And there's nothing there that says that your retrospective should take 15 minutes. In fact, there's a very kind of rule of thumb that it should take, for example, 2 hours in a 2-week sprint, right? If you go shorter, it takes less. If you go longer, it should take more, right? So we have learned Scrum is a collection of patterns collected from industry. Scrum is not the design of one or two people. The Scrum happened as a collection of many different individuals' perspective on what was already actually working in practice, right? So when we say, oh, Scrum says this, Scrum says that, okay, maybe it does. Some of it will be true, but we need to understand where Scrum came from. Scrum came from engineers like you and me who were actually in projects that weren't delivering or they weren't delivering value. And they started collecting a list of different patterns that when you put them together, that's what Scrum is, a list of patterns, a collection of patterns. When you put them together, increases massively your chance of delivering something and something of value, right? So it's important to know where that comes from. And if we want to criticize, and there's nothing wrong with criticizing, I think it's an important way in which we evolve our art. If we want to criticize, at least we should criticize what's actually defined as actual practice, right? So I think it's very important for us to refer to, for example, the Scrum book and also the Agile Manifesto, because those are the source texts. Those are the inspirations for everything that came after.
It's also interesting because we are in a generational shift. The next generation always questions the previous generation, right? Always saying, hey, that was stupid. This isn't how things should work. And we see that cyclical. Like there was a text from one of the philosophers that was criticizing another generation. And that goes as old as, 1,000 years old. But also I wanted to kind of talk about it because there's two concepts that people always confuse, especially the new generation coming through. The word empiricism in Scrum, what does that mean? It means experience. It means things that people learn from experience. The opposite of empiricism is Taylorism, which is something that is theoretical, developed in like academia without a touch of reality. So before somebody criticizes different aspects of something, it's really important. Is it experience or is it the recommended way? Because Vasco, even for you, I'm sure there's a lot of experience things in NoEstimates. And then there's a lot of like scientific, and sometimes you have to control which way do you lean towards, because like anything else, there is no panacea.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you just said is very important. Scrum, and actually the whole Agile movement, but Scrum specifically, was defined as empirical process control, which is not something that Scrum invented. This is something that comes, and they write about it in Agile Software Development with Scrum, the black book or original book that defines Scrum and I think popularized it as well. That empirical process control comes from chemistry, chemical processes that cannot be predicted accurately enough in advance, in theory. They need to be controlled as they happen, like the creation of fuels or polymers or whatever, like chemical processes that are happening in nature that we are harnessing for manufacturing processes, right? And there, while we are doing the manufacturing, we're not executing a predefined set of tasks. We are executing an empirical cycle. We do something, we evaluate the results, and then we do something else, right? And
yes.
Yeah, this is still single loop learning. So because we're only learning how to execute the process better, there's a second loop, which is to ask, why are we doing this step at all in the process? Could we find a better process? That's another thing we can talk about later. But this empiricism is very important, and it's a core aspect of the whole Agile movement. So when people say, hey, we have too many meetings, well, run an experiment with less meetings.
Yep.
Agile is all about running that experiment. When you feel there's too many meetings, take responsibility, do something different and measure it, make sure that it's better or not, and learn from it.
Yeah, it's all about change. When I learned Scrum, it was from a guy named Ken Schwaber who came to our company and worked with our teams. And there's one thing he said, don't take this as the only way. Take it as just one of the ways and adapt to your environment. When somebody criticizes things, I try to ask a question of why. And most of the time it's for reasons outside of the framework. It's something that's cultural, organizational, maybe even experience of that individual, because we do get biased based on our experience. If things went well, we're going to love it. If things didn't go well, we're going to hate it. So it's always going to go that way. Let's shift gear a little bit. I love this conversation. It's a great warm up. How does that impact NoEstimates? So the book was written 10 years ago. 10 years is half of our generational shift. What do you think is the most important thing for NoEstimates right now? Is it more relevant? Is it less relevant? Is it just as relevant? Where are we if you were to compare with the time when you first released the book?
So this is a great question because it allows me the opportunity to share that even though the book was published in 2015, I actually started experimenting with NoEstimate approaches in 2008 and started talking publicly in 2012. So even the book already reflects about 7 years of change in how to apply the ideas that are in the book, right? So the book came 7 years after I started experimenting and trying things out in practice, right? Like that empiricism that we were just talking about. And since then, the concept of NoEstimates has evolved greatly. I've been doing the NoEstimates workshop many times a year, every year since then. Hundreds of people have gone through the workshop and they have given me feedback. And that's incredibly powerful, right? To expose your ideas to the world and then getting that feedback, and that evolves my ideas further. And there's a lot of things that have changed. For example, I would argue that when I started NoEstimates, the core idea was to replace the practice of estimation. That was the core idea. And I would argue that today, nobody estimates in reality anymore. I mean, I know I'm exaggerating. A very common scenario, if you have somebody writing what needs to be done, then somebody else gives it a price or estimate. And then the team isn't even part of those two initial discussions and comes in later to deliver something that is probably not what was written and not what was estimated, but still being held to the estimate. We know how stupid and incredibly inadequate estimation is as a strategy, and here's the important part, to mitigate risks. In fact, I would say that estimation is a strategy for increasing risks rather than decreasing or mitigating risks. And this is very important. For those of you who have a project management background, you will understand the importance of this. NoEstimates these days is as much a risk management strategy, which Agile in itself is. NoEstimates is a risk management strategy now a lot more than it is a replacement for the estimation practice. And that, of course, comes through evolution, through application of the ideas, through learning and through adaptation. NoEstimates has a lot of applications on product management today that weren't clear in the book because I wasn't writing the book for that kind of reader. But if I would write the book today, I would definitely include the product management impact of the NoEstimates approach today, because estimation, it's a little bit like taking the layers off the onion, right? Like the first layer was the estimation practice. And then when you took that layer off, you started to realize where that estimation practice was coming from. Like what were the reasons why we were using estimates? And when you understand that, you start to replace those other practices with other approaches. For example, anyone listening to us today knows that the scope is variable in any software project. That in itself invalidates most of the use for what was called estimation when I wrote the book, right? These days, nobody really looks at estimation that way anymore. Everybody accepts in the software industry, everybody accepts that scope will vary. That's not even in cause anymore. But of course, that also means that, well, if scope will vary, then whatever is based on scope being fixed, like estimates, becomes an invalid theory, because the core aspect, the core fact that supports the theory for the use of estimates is gone.
Yeah. I always talk about the user centric design, which is great because, that's kind of our new waterfall, if you will. The waterfall of before started with system design. Now we usually go and do the mock-ups and screens and things like that at the product level. And that becomes our waterfall of the feature if we take a look at it. And then the first thing that happens is we play around with it. I don't know if anybody necessarily goes and takes any specific mock-up through user experience and actually gives it to real users to evaluate and provide feedback. That loop is really, really slow. So you can't put all of your features through it, maybe some. Most organizations talk about doing that. I doubt a lot do, unless it's something new that they're creating. But you're not going to take every change. And then what happens? People try to implement this. And I go through this all the time. We will have the best user experience, but after implementation, we're going to look at it and we're going to be like, well, that was stupid. Well, this doesn't look good. Well, this is awkward. Well, because the picture is only a picture. Once you turn it into a functioning design, it's completely different. You will tweak the screen size. The adaptive is going to go crazy. You're like, oh, we missed one more thing. And so what the teams are doing is they're iterating within one feature multiple times to get it to perfection. How do you account for these things? And it's really a just-in-time prioritization. Are we okay taking another iteration? Is this important enough to meet the goal? Or is this good enough? And these cycles, there's something that used to be called scope creep, but I actually don't like the word scope creep. Somebody says there's no such thing as scope creep. It's requirement clarity or the clarity of understanding.
Oh yeah, in the book I wrote the phrase, there's no such thing as scope creep. There's only value discovery.
Value discovery. Yes, I like that too. I think the concept of estimates is no longer applicable because our change is so far more dynamic than we ever envisioned. If you are a developer, chances are you're going to look at something and go, I hate the fact that people are asking me when I'm going to be done. But if you sit in the seat of an executive, that's a very critical piece of information because you need to line things up.
Yeah, I was going to say, you're absolutely right, except that it's the job of the executive to tell the developer when the developer needs to be done. Now, you can only say when or what. You can't say what and when, right? So when you say this is the date, then you can't say these are all the specs that you need to follow because it's not possible, right? You either fix the date or you fix the scope. You can't fix both. And we know this. This is kind of a given, an accepted fact in Agile, right? So what you said is true, but we can't take the responsibility away from the executive to own the business and actually say, this is when we need to release. Then it's up to the team to release whatever is possible at that time. And that's one of the things that has changed in NoEstimates. For example, one thing I don't talk too much about in the book, but has become a very important part of practice in the teams that use NoEstimates is that you're always ready to release. In fact, the rule of thumb is it should take you 24 hours to get a release out, period. No matter where you are, whatever is going on, in 24 hours, you should be able to do a release, whether it's a patch, a hot fix, or a completely new release with new features that are already ready at that time. And there's a lot of techniques that allow this, feature flagging and continuous delivery and continuous integration pipelines, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of things out there that already enable this. But it is, and I want to be very clear about this, in NoEstimates, we now say that it is the executive layer in the company responsibility to define when something needs to be delivered, or alternatively, what needs to be delivered, but not when. And it is the team to fill in the blank of the other question.
I agree with you here wholeheartedly, but I'm not talking about setting the deadlines. I guess maybe that's a little bit of my perspective, but when I'm working with the teams, I want to give them the time that they need to develop it. I want to add a little bit of pressure so we don't run into Parkinson's law, because peer pressure, you have to apply some. Otherwise,
but you are always subject to Parkinson's law. The question is, how long will you go until you discover that you're subject to Parkinson's law?
Well, all the time. But you want to set certain type of timelines, because otherwise it's a never-ending story, and people will make decisions.
That's why we have Timeboxes in Scrum. By the way.
Exactly. I agree. So you need a little bit of that peer pressure. However, what's important for me in understanding what's left and where are we. When I'm running my products, I have to coordinate the next steps. Okay, so the feature is going to be out. That's great. I got to talk to these 10 customers that I have lined up for that feature. I got to bring them up to date. I have to work with marketing. We have to push out content. We have to update the website. We have other things that are beyond software engineering that depend on it. There could be features that are promised to customers that will close the deal and sign the agreement because now it's available. There are revenue expectations. Now I can claim some. There's other things outside of just the software development deadlines. It's good to give the teams the ability to be flexible with the timeline if they want to have another iteration to improve the quality of what they want done. But it's not okay not to know where you are along the journey and not be able to bubble up that information. The higher levels are paralyzed, unable to plan or act on next steps.
Yeah. So that's a very easy problem to solve. For example, in NoEstimates, in the workshop, we do an exercise. The exercise is executed in about 30 minutes. That's 30 minutes, 30 minutes. And the exercise actually mimics projects that are in most organizations today implemented in 6 to 9 months, some maybe 12. And the teams during that exercise, they go from the initial setup, like this is what we need from you, to the delivery of the product in 30 minutes, 30 minutes. Now, they don't do the actual deployment of the product in an organization, because for that you would need the organization, but they plan the deployment, and the deployment needs to be feasible within 24 hours. Now, here's what we do with that exercise. We put them an impossible problem. We put forward to the teams an impossible problem, something that some of them, and in many cases that has happened, some of them might have executed a similar project in 6 to 9 or even 12 months. And the constraint is you need to have it ready in 30 minutes. You know what happens? So in 9 out of 10 cases, the team delivers something within the 30 minutes. There are some teams that don't, but most do. And in some cases, not always, but in some of the workshop instances, people have delivered different versions, right? Like for example, 2 separate implementations of the solution within the 30 minutes. Wow. And what we do in that particular exercise is to try to create this mental model that once we understand the constraint, we can perform to the constraint. And what happens these days, unfortunately, is that because of the mental model we are using, we are not able to accept that a constraint is a generative, a productive aspect of the delivery of value in a business or a nonprofit, right? So, for example, let's imagine the case, and it happened very rarely, but it did happen. Let's imagine the case that one of the teams was not able to deliver a working solution within 30 minutes. Well, it was only 30 minutes. Maybe with another 30, they can deliver. And even if they deliver in 2 or 3 hours, it's still a hell of a lot faster than 6 to 9 or even 12 months, which is what happens in other companies out there. So this is important for us to understand. And this is why very often I refer to NoEstimates as Agile pulled all the way to, or, pushed all the way to 11, like in the Spinal Tap documentary. Because what we're trying to put in practice with the NoEstimates approach is what Agile is, but on steroids. Is to allow people to deliver things, and this is how I phrase it. I want you to be able to do things that not even you thought were possible.
Yeah, this is where I go back again for all those folks that criticize Agile. I think a lot of times people don't have the experiences of participating in these workshops. They don't have the experiences of meeting kind of the heroes of our movement, if you will. Going to the conferences, like a lot of budgets have been cut. So if you show up to a typical Scrum gathering, mostly it's people that practice Scrum or other Agile practitioners. The community has shrunk quite a bit over the years. 20 years ago was a completely different picture. And I think it's important to bring it back. Maybe social media creates, a better opportunity now to share the knowledge to the wider audience. But I wouldn't go and necessarily criticize like things don't work. If things don't work, there's probably a reason why. And somebody needs to go on the route of self-discovery to find out where their negative emotions come from. Because it's sort of like the level of maturity, like when I was small, my dad was my hero, right? When I turned 16, he doesn't know anything. My dad just doesn't know anything. Yeah, he's just not the guy. When I'm 20, I'm like, maybe my dad knows a few things. And then like now that I'm 44, I'm like, what would my dad do? Right. So I think that's exactly the cycle. That's not a surprise how folks actually change from, and I'm going to go into politics here a little bit, but when they're younger, they're Democrats. When they're older, they turn Republican. So conservative nature is something that's connected to becoming wiser. But if you haven't experienced this, I do urge everybody, just sign up. Vasco's hosting a lot of things. He's extremely active in the community. You must listen and take notice, because if something doesn't work for you, there is always a way that you can discover a better alternative.
And that's really the core of Agile, right? Uncovering better ways by doing it and helping others do it. That's in the manifesto. That was written all the way in 2001. So let's keep that at the core of what we are trying to do. Because, Alex, you and I, we know the world runs on software. Like literally everything is software these days. We need to take responsibility as software developers for the welfare of our society. And I don't mean healthcare, although healthcare also runs on software, but I mean everything like transportation, scheduling, school information dissemination, helping our local mayor achieve a funding for a project that helps our community. Like everything runs on software these days. We need to take responsibility.
Yeah, I want to change gears a little bit, and I want to talk about how things actually got started, how you discovered NoEstimates. And then also I have some questions from the book, because in the NoEstimates approach, there are specific metrics that you're using. And I've recently published an article calling velocity and throughput as full of shit metrics. And I've been getting a lot of flack for actually calling it as it is. I'm not saying they're not useful metrics, but what they are is they could be weaponized in the wrong way and applied in the wrong way. So certainly something I learned from my experience running startups, if you're going to tell your investors a certain metric, they will use that metrics to measure you against it. And it's the same thing in software engineering. So protecting internal metrics is very important. But I want to pass it over to you. How'd you get started? How did you discover the consistency? Because there's a correlation that is uncanny.
Yeah. So the consistency that Alex, you're referring to is that just counting the number of stories is accurate enough. We don't need to size those stories. And there's many reasons for that. We don't need to go through all of those, but if you check out the book, there's some explanation, more in-depth explanation of why that works.
But you do talk about time boxing the stories to the features to certain size, and also the stories.
Let's go there in a second, Alex. That's a perfect question, but I do want to address the origin question, because I think it will be very informative.
Sure.
Okay. Picture this. I'm at Nokia at the time. We're running a massive program, 500 plus people all over the world, so 5 continents. Then we can't, literally, there's no way we can get a Gantt chart of all the work that needs to be done, right? There's no way that, there's 100 teams. Like you're not even going to get 100 answers, even if you email all of the teams. So there's no way you can get a Gantt chart. And the problem is we have a very clear deadline that's driven by the market, not the executives, right? I call it the Christmas problem. Christmas is always at the same time. If you need to sell a product for Christmas, you need to get it out at the right time. Otherwise, you are not selling, right? So there's a very clear externally imposed deadline. And the question is, are we going to deliver on time? And I start scratching my head and thinking, okay, so what can we do? And I have a background in project management. So obviously the tendency is in using project management tools like estimates. And that's why I know they don't work, because I've used them so much. And I realized that there's no way in hell anyone can get an answer from 100 different teams as to where they are. And we discussed that in the project management team. I was an Agile coach at the time. And the program manager, that's not project, program manager, above all the project managers in terms of hierarchy, he could get an answer from all the teams. Of course he could, but no one else. So the program manager writes a message to all of the teams. Here's the deadline. Here's what we need to deliver. Will you deliver on time? Guess how many teams said no?
Nobody.
0. Because when the question comes from the program manager, what are you going to do? Stick your neck out? Come on. The first thing you learn in an estimate-driven project is you're the last one raising your hand, because you know for sure somebody will be in deep doo-doo before you are.
Yep.
Right? Because if they raise their hand, they're the problem. And then you can lean back and say, it was their problem. That They are the reason we're late. And that's a game everybody plays in the projects. Yeah, everybody's bluffing. And then the first person to fold, then that's the blamed, the victim. Okay, so we're in this context. So there's no way we know, right? So there's, the program manager can answer that, can send the email, but you'll never get a straight answer. So together with a couple of people in the team, what we do is we start collecting the number of features, not stories. Stories inside the team, features above the team. So we start collecting the number of features delivered to the integration system every day. And because there's 100 teams, there's always something being delivered every single day. So we can count those. And we had the backlog because the product managers, were keeping the backlog up to date. So that was always being kept up to date because it was on a centralized tool. So we know exactly how many features are left and how many we are delivering. The ones we are delivering give us the rate of delivery. And the ones that are left give us the distance to the destination. So we call this these days, we call it the Disneyland problem. If you have 500 miles to drive to the Disneyland and it takes you, or you're driving at an average of 100 miles an hour, okay, that's too much, but let's use it for simplicity's sake. It will take you 5 hours unless you stop, right? And then you know how long it takes to stop, right? So that's easy. That's what we did at the time because we had 100 teams over 5 continents, impossible time zone, non-overlapping. And then the program manager, of course, I think naively and optimistically thinking they would get a straight answer, but they would never get a straight answer. So when we started looking at the data, we noticed that we were already at that time 3 months into a 6-month delivery. And I told him it's going to take 18 months. And of course he said, no, there's no way. That's when he sent the message and the team said, yeah, we'll deliver on time. Everybody said they will deliver on time. But here's the problem. And this is something that most program managers don't understand, is that even if every single team delivers on time, that doesn't tell you that your product is ready on time because every team is delivering a component of the final product. It's only measurable, the delivery rate is only measurable at the end of the line. That's why these days we say you need to count the running tested features delivered to production or a production-like environment. Anything delivered before that doesn't count. It's no progress, zero progress, right? Stories don't matter when you're measuring the progress at the product level. They matter when you're measuring the progress at the team level because that's what they deliver, right? So these layers are also important. So in other words, we were in a situation at Nokia back then where we could not by any means figure out when we were going to deliver unless we came up with a strategy like the one I just described. So that's where NoEstimates, the original NoEstimates approach came from, because we would not be able to use standard project management approaches to answer the question, when will we be ready?
Yeah, it's the question, are we there yet, from the kids while you're driving, right? I actually call it the GPS of software delivery. Because as you're driving, you're going to run into obstacles. Certain things will move faster. Certain things will move forward. Sometimes you'll need a detour. All of these things are the same as if you're just driving to get somewhere, but somehow Google Maps, Waze, or whatever you use, Apple Maps, always tells you when you're going to arrive. And the closer you are to the destination, the better is the precision. So, and it's the same thing with software project. That's why a lot of times pre-planning is not helpful. And actually, you point that out in the book, that you should just start, because all of that pre-planning time, that doesn't help. That's waste. The only time you're adding value is when you're delivering. And I agree with that. So now that the NoEstimates came up that way and you can track the work, has there been a change to the time boxing of the feature approach or the splitting of the stories time box? And also, there's a section that you recommend there, which I kind of like, I kind of like raised an eyebrow when it was a recommendation to actually apply story points. So it was a little strange one to me. I did not expect to see that. By the way, this isn't a traditional way of applying story points. It's a way to go away from hourly estimation, because 20 years ago, that was a typical way to estimate the hours. Like, how long is this project going to take? 10,000 hours. And that was the way it was budgeted. So, but there's actually a good way to apply hours if anybody wants to learn, but that's more on the finite level. It's more around team behaviors. Sorry, I asked too many questions. So what do you think about the time boxing of the feature and the splitting?
Yeah, look, this is a very important aspect. One of the core aspects that we've introduced with NoEstimates, I mean, many have talked about it, but NoEstimates made it kind of a very important process at the team level, was this idea of slicing. And Neil Killick, who was one of the original people talking about NoEstimates, he talked about the slicing heuristic. So basically an approach that would allow you to slice things so that they would take a very small amount of time. So for example, he talks about, you should slice your stories down to the single acceptance criteria, because then you get enough progress information, which is then useful for you to make decisions. But also, and this is very important, Neil also talks about it, and I talk about it in the NoEstimates workshop these days, it's a super powerful risk management strategy. So I'll give you a very concrete example. Let's say you have a story. For those of you who are not watching the video, that's fine. Imagine I'm holding two cards. When you slice a story, you get two halves of the story. Here's the thing. When you have two halves of the story, you can deliver one half and skip the second. So you've just reduced the time it takes to deliver something by splitting it into the most valuable items first, delivering that, checking if it's enough, and not delivering the rest. The not delivering the rest is actually part of the Agile Manifesto. It's about maximizing the work not done. It's about focusing simplicity. Yeah, simplicity, the art of maximizing amount of work not done, is essential. This is in the Agile Manifesto. I didn't invent that. I just discovered a very practical way in which to apply that Agile principle, right? And that's slicing. We always slice things down to, and here's where the time boxing that Alex was referring to comes in. Our rule of thumb is it should take one person 1 day to develop one story. And the reason for that is very simple, because if they haven't delivered that story by the next daily stand-up, you already know that you're late. That is super important information. That's why we say it takes 1 day, one person. Now, we don't slice the story to fit that constraint. We stipulate it as a constraint.
Okay.
So that we can make a decision in the next daily to decide whether to continue with that story or drop it altogether, or to consider what has been done good enough and move on. We trigger a decision making. Now, we do that at the story level, one person, 1 day, so that you can immediately find out if you're late. Then the second is the feature. And in the feature, we say it should take a sprint or 2 sprints, if you wish, to deliver a feature. Right? Why? Same reason. Because if you haven't delivered the feature by the end of the sprint or by the end of 2 sprints after starting, right? The time starts when you start working on the feature. Then you already know you're late. And now you can decide whether you want to continue to invest in that feature. So add whatever was left, or just stop there and move on to another feature. And then at the same level, we do the same for the epics. And we say that an epic should be delivered within 3 months. So that when the time starts counting, if you haven't delivered by the end of the 3 months, which is a quarter, right? Then you can then decide, do I continue to invest in this epic? Do I consider it good enough for now? Or is it even relevant anymore? So what we're doing with this time boxing or stipulating the enabling constraint is to trigger decision points. And this is where risk management is to trigger decision points. Because otherwise, what we're doing is just investing. And, at some point, maybe we stop investing, but we usually don't because of the sunk cost fallacy, right? So it's very important to understand that what we do in that approach that you describe as time boxing is stipulating an enabling constraint to trigger decisions, because it's people that should be making decisions over software and not software making decisions over people.
I like that, Vasco. I do have a couple things that I wanted to point out here that I see teams doing. Number one, splitting stories by component-based work, things that are not value-based.
Oh my God. I thought we fixed it in the end of the 90s.
No, we didn't. People still do this. Hey, implement the API, implement the front end as a separate thing, integration test as a separate story. This is called the work-based stream, not the value-based stream. As soon as the teams start doing that, this is becoming a micromanaging nightmare.
That's why you need project managers then. First architects, then project managers.
And this is the point where nothing will ever get done. And also the work will be hidden in between of the stories. Because the same as your example of all teams delivering and you need the time to bring it all together and integrate, that work is never accounted for because it doesn't belong in any specific backlog item. Somebody's going to have to do it in a skunkworks mode, invisible and oblivious, and everything else is going to be delayed. The other thing that is important is, and this is for me, it's very hard for me as a developer to envision getting anything done in a day. Slicing it down to that level, giving all of...
But Alex, then you should come to my workshop and I'll get you to deliver something in 30 minutes.
Awesome. But hear me out, because we put so much tax on the engineer right now around the scope of delivery and what it must contain. The infamous PR reviews that delay things for days, the wait times, the automation tests failing, people have no control over, the handoffs from different people. It's practically impossible to get things knocked out real quick. And then we wonder why we can't do things very, very rapidly. Like the practice of swarming entire team around different capabilities is something that's kind of coming up now more than ever, and only focusing on one very specific goal as opposed to different work. I just wanted to point that out because people will hear, hey, Vasco said this, and just gonna, parade with that statement and misrepresent it completely. Like I had comments on LinkedIn that somebody says, I don't understand what NoEstimates are and how to do things. And I was like, I understand things just fine. I was even offered free consulting by this one individual who disagreed with what I was saying, which was kind of funny. I said, thank you, pass on the consulting. But ultimately, like, guys, you have to listen to the details and understand them well. Don't just take a blanket statement because you saw the text, because somebody said A. There's a lot of context. Go read the book. Go talk to Vasco, because the devil's in the details. You really got to comprehend entirety. Don't just take the statement and run with it. It will get you in trouble.
Yeah, or if you do take the statement and run with it, make sure your time box is so small that it's not going to hurt when you hit your head in the wall.
That's a good point.
It's okay to make mistakes as long as the scope is very minute, right? So if you try to slice a story down to a day, don't start with a story that feels like a 2-week or even a 3-week story, right? Start with one acceptance criteria of that story. Start something that feels like, okay, this is not daunting, right? Because one of the things that very often happens, and this is why we get down to this component-specific stories that you were talking about, or architectural layer stories that you were talking about, that we get to that because we lack the imagination. And it's okay because it takes time and effort to develop that imagination, right? So it's okay to lack it when we start. So let's start with a very small scope and move on from there. Many years ago, I used to do a test-driven development workshop for managers. It happened in Excel because that's where managers spend most of their time, right? So we actually managers practiced test-driven development with just an Excel sheet, nothing else. There was no Visual Basic. It was just the sheet, nothing else, right? And why did we do that? Because we wanted to help the manager understand the power of the TDD cycle, red, green, refactor, right? First you write the test. That's always how it is. First you write the test. Then you do something to implement the solution for the test. And when it's running, you refactor, right? Red, meaning that you're probably going to fail for a while. That's okay because it's such a small thing. Then you're going to make it work. And then after you make it work, you make it better, right? And we needed to go to that level in order to get managers to understand the power of that mental model, the TDD or test-driven development mental model. Because many managers would just say, oh, but that is wasteful, right? Because you're writing the test first. You don't have a code. What are you going to do? Well, that's how the process works. It's actually a cognitive process, and it has been proven to work. And it saved my butt many a time because I'm not that good a developer. And the only way I could even seem to be a good developer is because I was using TDD.
That's what every good developer says. I'm not a good developer. That's why I say I'm a really good developer. And the opposite is true. Actually, I do this with my teams a lot in terms of test-driven development. If a bug comes up, the first thing that will pop out is a test because I don't want it to come back. And that means that we actually have a gap. That's why the bug actually came out, unless it's something, very trivial on the front end. I do have a question here. The use of throughput. So you're collecting cycle times, obviously. And then based on the cycle times, like you're trying to control the cycle times and you're looking overall to do the forecasting on the NoEstimates move. Have you seen that to be pretty true and evident, even despite the changes in 10 years from before? Is it still appropriate? Because the cycle time has become a frequently talked about metric.
Okay, so just to be clear, in the NoEstimates, as I define it in the book, it's not the whole picture, right? It's the picture from 2015.
Mm-hmm.
In NoEstimates, as I define it in the book, we measure throughput, number of stories completed per sprint. And then, of course, the goal is to figure out how many sprints does it still take for us to deliver the stories that are left in the backlog, right? So that's why we measure it. And that's still valid. Like most of the teams that I work with still use that as kind of the, let's call it the easy heuristic to answer the question, when will we be ready? But what I do these days is that I work with the product managers and the product owners to actually use that piece of information to make a much more important question, which is, what do we want to deliver? Not how much is there to deliver, but rather what do we want to deliver? Because product managers and product owners, they need to consider the business aspect, not just the engineering, let's say, investment or time that it takes to deliver something. They need to consider, does it even make sense? Can we get information from the market that allows us to be more clear about what does not need to be delivered? In fact, the most powerful and most economically effective type of decision that one can make is what not to do, because it's free not to do something.
Mm-hmm.
And it's done immediately, right? If you go through your backlog and you take 50% of the stories out, you're going to be, on average, 50% faster, right? Like not exactly, but around that.
Well, you don't need to go through the entire backlog, obviously, right? Because there's going to be things in there that you don't intend on doing now. So you have to actually organize the backlog by your goals. What is the next goal? And only target predicting or forecasting that goal delivery, right? And then once you get there, there's the next goal and you can start that one.
Yeah, and it's important that you said goal. I want to build on that because the goal is not how do we get there. This is very important. In really advanced NoEstimates team, they're not using throughput anymore because what matters is the goal. What matters is measuring the progress towards the goal, not measuring the progress through the backlog, because the backlog is in constant flux. Mm-hmm. So what we do with those teams is that we actually focus on enabling them to run constant customer-facing experiments to measure progress towards a business goal. And that is 10xing your product development. And by 10xing, I mean doing it 10 times faster, 10 times cheaper, or delivering 10 times more value. That's what I mean, very practically, right? So if I take a goal, for example, of increasing the conversion of a particular part of our product, whether it's feature usage or subscription-based or whatever, just the conversion of a part of our product, then I can run experiments on that part of the product, even without running software. A lot of my work these days is working with teams on answering critical product questions, value questions, without writing software. And the reason for that is very simple. If you don't need to write software, you're done. So if you can answer the question with a couple of interviews, a landing page test, a paper prototype, or whatever technique you're using, then you might potentially save the team weeks, if not months of work. And that is 10xing your product development process. And that's what we talk about these days in the NoEstimates workshop. Of course, is still a lot about throughput and how to do that, but it is also a lot about how to 10x your product development process. And that is what Agile was all about and still is all about. And a lot of the complaints come from the old school approach of writing all the requirements up front and then just pushing it onto an agile team, quote unquote, because they can work faster.
Is this where the NoBacklogs movement came from?
Absolutely. We don't use backlogs anymore in the most advanced teams that I work with. We use other things, just to be clear. We're not just, winging it or putting our finger in the air. We're doing concrete aspects or concrete practices, right? For example, we always have a product vision. We always have a concrete business goal. We use tools for that. We always have a way to decompose the business goal into goals at the team level. For example, in one of my clients, every team has a business-facing metric that they are optimizing for and a group of metrics that they are using, as we call them, as balancing metrics, because you don't want to optimize one metric. Even if you have one metric as the goal, you still need to keep your eyes in metrics around that metric. So these days, it's all about no backlogs. It's not about burdening teams with a long list of, I call them a shopping list, right? They call those teams shopping list managers. Here's a list, now go and do the shopping. No, that's not what we want. We want teams to bring in their creativity. Technical people bring in technical creativity, designers and user experience people bring in that type of creativity, product people bring in that type of creativity. We want to harness that creativity to deliver value for the customers and ultimately the business, but always first with the customers because they are the ones paying. So that's what we do these days. And yeah, as you said, very well pointed out, NoEstimates also includes no backlog.
If there's one criticism that I have, it's the name. So I know in the end of the book, somebody proposed May estimates or something that I don't like that either. I would rather flip it, something that's more positive and not a no, because it doesn't actually negate anything you're doing. It just puts a different spin on it. And
I guess I owe too much to the punk movement not to use the no.
Well, that's fair.
Those of you old enough to know what punk is will know why the no is there.
Well, Vasco, thanks for your time. This has been a great talk. We did not get a chance to cover all the topics. I know you and we connected previously, and something both of us really wanted to explore is the wrong approach to project budgeting and how things are done from the financial standpoint. Hopefully, if you guys like this episode, then we're going to get a lot of likes and interests. If you do that, Vasco is going to allocate some more time for me so we can talk about the financial aspects, something that folks don't talk about in the industry, how budgeting is done, how decision-making is done at the feature level. But before we disconnect, I have one final question to Vasco, which is, what happened to Carmen in the book? Was she successful?
Yeah, of course. And she's moving on to other things. There's a lot of stuff happening. Let's just say that Carmen is busy applying Agile, but turning it all the way up to 11.
I'm super excited to hear, all through the book, I was like worried about her losing her role. So, yeah, a little bit of a suspense there. So glad to hear. Well, thanks again, guys. Like, subscribe, let us know what you'd like to hear. Any questions, I will share Vasco's LinkedIn and links to the book as well. So do follow up. If you are in the engineering, in project management, this is the stuff to really understand. Whichever way you decide to run your teams, that's purely up to you. But do yourself a favor and build your knowledge. It will make you better at your craft. Thank you, Vasco.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Alex. It's been a pleasure.